You have been praying for years, perhaps decades, asking, hoping, pleading, repeating words learned long ago, yet somewhere deep within you there is a quiet feeling that prayer could be more than this. Not louder, not longer, not more emotional, but deeper, simpler, truer. Prayer was never meant to be an effort to persuade a distant power or to convince life to finally cooperate with your desires. Prayer was meant to be an awakening, a shift in awareness, a gentle but radical change in how you see yourself, how you see God, and how you see the world. And this is why the next 21 days matter more than you realize, because transformation does not come from changing circumstances, but from changing consciousness. Most people pray from a sense of lack. They begin with the silent assumption that something is missing, something is wrong, something must be fixed. They approach prayer as a request sent outward, upward, somewhere beyond themselves. Yet prayer that flows from lack can only reinforce lack, because consciousness always reproduces itself. What you hold in awareness, you express and experience. If you pray believing you are weak, you remain weak. If you pray believing you are separated, you remain separated. If you pray believing that good is scarce and must be begged for, life continues to appear that way. True prayer begins when you stop talking and start listening, when you move from asking to recognizing. It is not an attempt to get something from God, but an openness to what already is. There is a presence closer than breath, more intimate than thought, already complete, already whole, already expressing itself as you. Prayer is not bringing God into your life. Prayer is the realization that God has never been absent. The only absence has been awareness. For many, prayers become habit rather than communion. Words are spoken automatically, often with sincerity, yet without inner stillness. But words, even beautiful ones, cannot substitute for awareness. There is a point where prayer must outgrow language, because the deepest truths are not spoken, they are realized. Silence is not the absence of prayer. Silence is prayer fulfilled. In silence, the mind relaxes its struggle to control outcomes, and the soul begins to recognize what has always been true. You do not change prayer by learning new phrases or memorizing more affirmations. You change prayer by changing the place within you from which prayer arises. When prayer rises from fear, it seeks protection. When prayer rises from desire, it seeks acquisition. But when prayer rises from understanding, it rests. It rests in the certainty that the source of all life is not separate from the life you are living. In that resting, something profound happens. The sense of striving dissolves and guidance replaces effort. The mind has been trained to believe that problems exist independently, that disease, lack, conflict, and failure have power of their own. From that belief, prayer becomes a weapon or a shield. But there is a higher vision, one that sees appearances as expressions of thought, belief, and consciousness. When consciousness changes, appearances must follow. Prayer, then, is not aimed at changing the outer picture, but at aligning awareness with truth. The outer change is a consequence, not the goal. For 21 days, imagine releasing the habit of telling God what you want, and instead practicing the art of inner listening. This does not mean passivity, it means receptivity. It means trusting that intelligence greater than personal thought is already governing the universe, including your life. When you stop interfering with fear and begin cooperating with truth, life responds with harmony that feels effortless, though it is deeply ordered. There is a difference between believing in God and abiding in God. Belief still holds distance. Abiding dissolves it. Abiding is not an emotional experience. It is a steady awareness. It is the quiet knowing that no matter what appears, there is an underlying order that cannot be disturbed. Prayer that comes from this awareness does not beg for peace. It rests in peace. It does not ask for supply. It recognizes abundance as a law, not a reward. Many have been taught that prayer must be intense to be effective, that suffering makes prayer more sincere. But intensity often belongs to the ego struggling for control. Truth does not require intensity. It requires recognition. The sun does not strain to shine. Life does not struggle to express itself. When prayer aligns with the natural flow of being, it becomes simple, gentle, and powerful beyond measure. There will be resistance because the mind is accustomed to effort. Silence can feel uncomfortable at first, as though nothing is happening. Yet in that apparent nothingness, everything is happening. Seeds do not sprout by being shouted at. They grow in quiet darkness. Consciousness unfolds the same way. When you sit in stillness, Not trying to fix, not trying to heal, not trying to achieve. Something within you remembers itself. This remembering is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with fanfare. It is subtle, like a shift in gravity. You begin to notice that reactions soften. Situations that once triggered fear now pass with less intensity. Solutions appear without being forced. Relationships realign naturally. This is not because you prayed harder, but because you stopped resisting the intelligence already at work. Prayer, at its highest, is not a personal act. It is impersonal awareness. It is the realization that the same life animating the stars is animating you. When prayer becomes impersonal, it becomes universal. It is no longer about my problem or my need, but about alignment with truth. In that alignment, personal needs are met without being the focus. The world teaches you to measure success by visible outcomes, but spiritual understanding measures success by inner freedom. When prayer frees you from fear, it has done its work. When prayer releases you from the belief that you must control life, it has fulfilled its purpose. The other improvements are natural side effects, not the proof. In these 21 days, you are not trying to become more spiritual. You are uncovering what has always been present. You are not adding anything to yourself. You are subtracting false beliefs. You are letting go of the idea that you are a separate entity struggling in a hostile world. You are allowing the awareness of unity to replace the illusion of separation. This shift does not require withdrawal from daily life. On the contrary, it brings prayer into everything you do. Work becomes prayer when it is done in awareness. Listening becomes prayer when it is done without judgment. Rest becomes prayer when it is free of guilt. Prayer ceases to be an activity and becomes a way of being. The mind may ask, "What about my problems?" But problems are only unresolved states of consciousness. When consciousness is illumined, problems dissolve or lose their power. This does not mean challenges disappear overnight, but they no longer define you. You move through them with a sense of guidance rather than desperation. There is a profound freedom in realizing that you do not need to convince God of anything. You do not need to explain your pain or justify your desires. The infinite already knows, not intellectually, but by being the very life that feels, moves, and acts as you. Prayer is the acceptance of this intimacy, not the attempt to create it. As days pass, you may notice a temptation to return to old patterns of pleading and fear-based prayer. This is natural. Habits formed over years do not dissolve instantly, but each time you notice and gently return to awareness, the habit weakens. Grace is patient. Truth does not condemn relapse. It quietly invites remembrance again and again. Eventually, prayer becomes less about moments set aside and more about a continuous awareness. You begin to live from a center rather than from reaction. Decisions arise from clarity instead of anxiety. You trust more, not because life has proven itself predictable, but because you have discovered a stability within that does not depend on outcomes. This is the real change in prayer, moving from trying to use God to trusting God, from asking life to bend to your will to allowing your will to align with life. In that alignment, effort gives way to flow, fear gives way to confidence, and struggle gives way to peace. When prayer is understood in this way, it no longer competes with action. Action becomes inspired rather than forced. You do what is yours to do, calmly, efficiently, without the burden of personal strain. Results unfold in their own time, often in ways you could not have planned, yet perfectly suited to your growth. You may still speak words in prayer, but the words will come from fullness, not emptiness. They will be acknowledgments rather than demands, gratitude rather than anxiety, recognition rather than persuasion. And sometimes there will be no words at all, only a deep inner yes to life as it is unfolding. This transformation does not make you indifferent, it makes you compassionate without being burdened. You can care deeply without absorbing fear. You can serve without sacrificing inner peace. You can love without clinging. Prayer refines love by removing fear from it. In time, you realize that prayer was never about changing God's mind. It was about allowing your own mind to be changed, softened, opened, illumined. When the mind is illumined, it reflects truth naturally, just as a calm lake reflects the sky without effort. What you are entering is not a discipline of willpower, but but a surrender of resistance. Not a technique to master, but an awareness to rest in. The next 21 days are not a test. They are an invitation to stop striving and start trusting, to move from noise to stillness, from seeking to recognizing. And as this recognition deepens, prayer ceases to feel like something you do and becomes something you live, a quiet communion woven into every moment, shaping your experience from the inside out. Gently, inevitably, and without strain. Prayer is a shift in awareness, not a request for favors. True prayer is not about asking a distant power to change circumstances, but about awakening to an ever-present divine reality within. When consciousness changes from lack to recognition, life naturally begins to reflect harmony, guidance, and peace. Silence and inner listening are the highest forms of prayer. Words and repetition cannot replace stillness. In silence, the struggle to control outcomes dissolves, allowing deeper wisdom to emerge. Listening inwardly aligns the mind with truth and opens the way for effortless unfoldment. Praying from fear reinforces fear. Praying from understanding brings rest. The state of consciousness from which prayer arises determines its effect. Fear-based prayer sustains struggle, while prayer rooted in understanding rests in trust, allowing solutions and healing to appear without strain. Prayer aligns consciousness first. Outer change follows naturally. Problems are not independent powers, but expressions of thought and belief. When prayer illumines consciousness, outer conditions must shift accordingly, making visible change a consequence rather than the goal. Prayer becomes a way of being, not an isolated act. As awareness deepens, prayer extends into everyday life, work, relationships, decisions, and rest. Life itself becomes a continuous communion marked by trust, clarity, compassion, and inner freedom. Most people approach prayer as though they are standing outside of life, looking inward, trying to persuade an unseen power to intervene on their behalf. This approach quietly assumes separation, that God is there and you are here, that good must travel a distance to reach you, and that your role is to ask convincingly enough to deserve it. From this standpoint, prayer becomes a transaction, an exchange based on effort, emotion, or repetition. Yet this way of praying often leaves people exhausted, uncertain, and still searching, because it is built on a misunderstanding of the nature of prayer itself. Prayer is not a request sent outward. It is a recognition that turns inward. It begins with the realization that life is not divided, that the source of all being is not distant or selective, but present, whole, and complete. When prayer is treated as asking, it keeps consciousness focused on what seems missing. When prayer is understood as awareness, consciousness rests in what already is. Whatever occupies consciousness expresses itself as experience. And this is why prayer, rooted in recognition, has a power that effort-driven asking never achieves. Asking implies doubt, even when spoken with faith-filled words. Beneath the request lies the question of whether good will come, whether it will arrive in time, whether it will arrive at all. Recognition dissolves that doubt by shifting attention away from appearances and toward the underlying reality that sustains all appearances. In this shift, prayer stops being about changing events and becomes about aligning perception with truth. You are no longer trying to make something happen. You are allowing yourself to see what has always been happening beneath the surface. When prayer arises from lack, it reinforces the belief in lack. The mind says, I do not have, therefore I must ask. Consciousness accepts this premise and continues to produce experiences that confirm it. This is not punishment or failure, it is simply the nature of consciousness reflecting itself. But when prayer arises from understanding, it begins with the acknowledgement that supply, harmony, intelligence, and life itself are already present as law, not as exception. From this standpoint, prayer is not a plea but an acceptance. This acceptance is not passive resignation. It is an active inner alignment that releases the need to struggle. The moment you stop trying to force outcomes through prayer, you create space for guidance to emerge. Ideas arise naturally. Right action becomes clear without pressure. Opportunities appear without manipulation. These are not miracles in the dramatic sense. They are the natural results of consciousness no longer obstructed by fear and doubt. Many people fear that if they stop asking, nothing will happen. They believe effort is required to move life forward, even in prayer. But effort belongs to the personal sense of self that believes it is separate and alone. When that belief softens, prayer becomes cooperation rather than control. You begin to trust that the same intelligence governing the movement of planets and seasons is capable of governing the details of your life without constant instruction. Prayer understood as awareness changes the quality of inner life. Instead of mentally rehearsing problems in the name of prayer, you rest from them. Instead of explaining pain to God, you allow pain to be met by presence. Instead of visualizing outcomes with tension, you let go into a quiet expectancy. This expectancy is not hope tinged with anxiety, it is confidence without urgency. It knows that what is true must express itself in appropriate form. As this way of praying deepens, you begin to notice that outer conditions respond to inner shifts. Situations that once felt overwhelming lose their emotional charge. Conflicts soften, not always because others change, but because your perception changes. Needs are met in unexpected ways, often without the strain you once believed necessary. Life feels less like a series of battles and more like a guided unfolding. This transformation does not mean you stop caring about outcomes. It means outcomes no longer dominate your inner state. You act when action is required, but action arises from clarity rather than fear. Prayer has done its work before the outer step is taken. The inner alignment comes first, the visible result follows in its own rhythm. Over time, you realize that prayer was never meant to be a tool for fixing life, because life itself is not broken. What was fractured was perception. When perception heals, experience reorganizes. Prayer, then, is the healing of perception. It is the gentle return to see life as supported, intelligent, and purposeful, even when appearances temporarily suggest otherwise. This way of praying removes the burden of trying to earn good. You no longer measure prayer by how emotional it feels or how long it lasts. You measure it by the peace it leaves behind. When prayer leaves you calmer, clearer, and more trusting, it has fulfilled its function. The absence of struggle is not laziness, it is alignment. In this understanding, prayer does not compete with practical action. It precedes it. It clears the inner atmosphere so that whatever you do next is done from wisdom rather than reaction. The outer step may be small or ordinary, but it carries the weight of inner certainty. This is why prayer as awareness is so quietly powerful. It does not announce itself, yet it reshapes experience from the inside outward. When prayer is no longer about asking for change, but about recognizing truth, life stops feeling like something you must persuade. It becomes something you cooperate with. You begin to live from a deeper center, one that does not rise and fall with circumstances, one that remains steady whether conditions appear favorable or challenging. From this center, prayer is continuous, not as words or thoughts, but as a settled awareness that life is already held, already guided, already complete. For many, prayer has been reduced to words spoken from memory, phrases repeated out of habit, and requests shaped by fear or urgency. While sincerity may be present, something essential is often missing: stillness. Without stillness, prayer remains on the surface of the mind, moving in circles of thought, rather than descending into awareness. The deepest form of prayer begins not when the mouth speaks, but when the inner noise quiets enough for listening to occur. Silence is not emptiness, nor is it inactivity. It is a state of receptivity in which the mind releases its constant need to interpret, analyze, and control. In this release, a deeper intelligence becomes apparent. Many resist silence because it feels unfamiliar and unproductive. The mind, trained to equate effort with effectiveness, assumes that if nothing is being said, nothing is happening. Yet silence is the womb of insight, the place where truth reveals itself without force. When prayer is filled with words, the mind remains occupied with its own concerns. Even beautiful and heartfelt language can become a barrier if it prevents inward listening. Words often reinforce personal viewpoints, personal needs, and personal fears. Silence, on the other hand, dissolves these boundaries. In silence, the sense of a separate self softens and awareness expands beyond personal limitation. Listening in prayer is not the same as waiting for a voice or a sign. It is an attitude of openness, a willingness to let go of preconceived answers. Guidance does not always arrive as a clear instruction. Sometimes it appears as a feeling of peace, a shift in perspective, or a sudden release of tension. These subtle movements are easily missed when the mind is busy speaking. Silence creates the sensitivity needed to recognize them. In stillness, Prayer moves from effort to trust. You are no longer trying to convince life to cooperate. You are allowing yourself to be aligned with what already is. This alignment has a stabilizing effect. Instead of reacting to problems with anxiety, you observe them from a place of inner calm. From this calm, responses arise naturally, often simpler and more effective than anything produced by mental struggle. The practice of silence reveals how often prayer has been used as a way to rehearse worries. Many prayers are filled with detailed descriptions of problems as though repeating them might somehow resolve them. But consciousness does not heal by repetition of difficulty. It heals through illumination. Silence allows light to reach places that words cannot. It brings attention to the underlying beliefs that sustain problems and gently loosens their hold. At first, silence may feel uncomfortable. Thoughts continue to arise, and the urge to fill the space with words can be strong. This is not failure, it is exposure. Silence reveals the habits of the mind that usually go unnoticed. With gentle persistence, these habits begin to lose their authority. Thoughts still come, but they no longer dominate. Awareness becomes more spacious, more settled. As inner listening deepens, prayer becomes less about moments set aside and more about a quality carried into daily life. You begin to notice pauses between thoughts, moments of clarity in ordinary activities, and a sense of guidance present even in routine decisions. Silence follows you, not as absence, but as presence. It becomes a background awareness that steadies you amid activity. This form of prayer does not withdraw you from the world, it changes how you engage with it. Conversations become more attentive. Actions become more deliberate. Reactions soften because there is space between stimulus and response. In that space, wisdom operates. Silence makes room for intelligence to act without interference. The power of silence lies in its ability to dissolve false assumptions. Many struggles are sustained not by external conditions but by internal narratives. Silence interrupts these narratives. It allows you to see that many fears are built on imagined outcomes rather than present reality. In this seeing, fear loses its grip and confidence emerges without being manufactured. Listening prayer also reshapes trust. Trust is no longer an effort to believe that things will work out. It becomes a natural response to repeated experiences of inner guidance. Each time clarity arises from stillness, trust strengthens. Over time, this trust replaces the need for constant reassurance. You no longer require signs or confirmations to feel supported. Silence teaches patience, not as waiting, but as allowing. Life has its own rhythm, and silence attunes you to it. You stop forcing timing and begin to sense when action is appropriate and when stillness is required. This sensitivity prevents wasted effort and unnecessary struggle. In the quiet of listening, prayer reveals its true nature as communion rather than communication. You are not sending messages outward. You are becoming aware of an unbroken connection. This awareness brings a sense of belonging that words cannot provide. The feeling of being separate, which fuels anxiety and striving, gradually dissolves. As this way of praying becomes familiar, the desire to return toward heavy, anxious prayer diminishes. You still may speak when words are helpful, but words arise from stillness rather than replacing it. They carry a different quality, less urgency, more clarity, less fear, more assurance. Through silence, prayer accomplishes what effort cannot. It aligns you with a depth of wisdom that does not argue or persuade, but simply is. In this alignment, life unfolds with greater ease, not because challenges disappear, but because you meet them from a place of grounded awareness rather than restless thought. When prayer is shaped by fear, it carries the vibration of fear into every word and thought. Even when the language sounds hopeful, the underlying emotion reveals itself through urgency, tension, and the need for reassurance. Fear-based prayer often asks for protection, escape, or rescue, quietly assuming that life is dangerous and that good is uncertain. From this state of consciousness, prayer becomes a reaction rather than a realization, and whatever is realized in consciousness tends to express itself in experience. Fear narrows perception. It convinces the mind that it must constantly watch for threats, anticipate loss, and prepare for disappointment. When prayer arises from this mental climate, it reinforces the very conditions it seeks to escape. The mind repeatedly turns its attention to what it does not want, believing that naming the danger will somehow neutralize it. Yet consciousness does not distinguish between fear imagined and fear desired. It responds to focus and belief. What the mind dwells upon, it energizes. Understanding shifts prayer from reaction to rest. Instead of responding to appearances with anxiety, understanding recognizes that appearances are not final authorities. Beneath every condition lies a deeper reality that remains undisturbed. Prayer rooted in understanding does not deny challenges, but it refuses to grant them ultimate power. It begins with the acknowledgement that truth is present, even when it is not yet visible. Resting prayer does not feel dramatic. It feels calm, grounded, and often deceptively simple. There is no inner argument, no mental pleading, no attempt to persuade. The mind stops rehearsing possible outcomes and settles into trust. This trust is not blind optimism. It is confidence based on an awareness of an underlying order that governs life consistently, even when circumstances appear chaotic. Fear-based prayer often asks, "What if?" Understanding asks, "What is true now?" This shift changes everything. Instead of projecting imagined futures, attention returns to present awareness. In the present, fear loses much of its power because it thrives on anticipation rather than reality. Prayer becomes an anchoring into the now, where clarity is accessible. When understanding guides prayer, the need for constant reassurance fades. You are no longer checking inwardly to see if your prayer was good enough, or if you believed strongly enough. These doubts belong to a mindset that sees prayer as a performance. Resting prayer has no audience and no scorecard. It is complete in itself. As fear dissolves, the body responds. Tension softens, breathing deepens, and the nervous system begins to regulate itself. This physical ease is not separate from spiritual understanding. It is an expression of it. When the mind stops signaling danger, the body follows. Prayer then supports not only emotional balance but physical well-being. Understanding also changes how you interpret outcomes. Fear-based prayer judges results quickly, labeling them as success or failure. Resting prayer allows events to unfold without immediate judgment. You begin to see that some answers arrive as redirection, some as delay, and some as quiet inner strength rather than outer change. This broader view prevents disappointment from hardening into despair. In fear-based prayer, the self feels isolated, struggling alone against overwhelming forces. In understanding, the sense of isolation dissolves. You recognize that you are not facing life by yourself, you are participating in a larger movement of intelligence. This recognition brings humility without weakness and confidence without arrogance. Understanding does not mean suppressing emotion. Fear may still arise, but it is met with awareness rather than panic. You notice it, acknowledge it, and allow it to pass without giving it authority. Prayer becomes the space in which emotions are observed and integrated rather than acted out. This space is what allows wisdom to emerge. As this way of praying stabilizes, reactions to challenges change noticeably. Situations that once triggered immediate anxiety now evoke curiosity or calm assessment. You respond instead of react. This does not mean you become detached or indifferent. It means your engagement is clearer and more effective. Resting prayer also frees you from the belief that constant vigilance is required to stay safe. You begin to trust that life supports life, that intelligence is not fragile, and that you do not need to manage every detail mentally. This trust releases enormous energy previously spent on worry and control. Over time, fear-based prayer feels increasingly unnatural, like wearing a garment that no longer fits. You may still catch yourself slipping into old habits during moments of stress, but recovery is quicker. Awareness recognizes the shift and gently returns to rest. This gentle return is itself an expression of understanding. In this resting awareness, prayer fulfills its true function, not to change an unpredictable world, but to establish stability within. From that stability, actions are wiser, relationships are more balanced, and challenges are met with resilience rather than resistance. The outer world may still present uncertainty, but the inner ground remains steady, providing a foundation from which life can be lived with greater ease and confidence. Many people expect prayer to produce immediate changes in circumstances, and when those changes do not appear, they assume prayer has failed. This expectation places attention on effects rather than causes. Yet every outer condition has an inner origin in thought. belief and consciousness. Prayer that aims directly at outer change often overlooks the deeper level where real transformation begins. When prayer is understood as alignment of consciousness, its effectiveness is measured not by speed of results but by depth of inner shift. Outer conditions are not independent forces acting upon you, they are expressions of states of awareness. This does not mean that challenges are imaginary or unimportant, but it does mean they are not self-created powers. When prayer illumines consciousness, it alters the inner climate from which experiences arise. This inner change may be subtle, but it is decisive. The outer picture must eventually conform to the inner state, just as the reflection changes when the object before the mirror changes. Prayer that aligns consciousness does not ignore practical needs. It addresses them at their source. Instead of focusing on the visible problem, it attends to the beliefs that sustain it. This shift removes the pressure to manipulate circumstances and replaces it with the understanding that when perception changes, appropriate action and outcomes follow naturally. Often, the first sign that prayer is working is not an outer improvement but an inner release. Anxiety eases, obsession with outcomes softens. You find yourself less preoccupied with how, and more present with now. This is not resignation, it is readiness. Inner readiness creates the conditions for wise action without forcing. As consciousness aligns, insights arise that were previously inaccessible. You see options you had overlooked, hear guidance you had dismissed, and recognize patterns you had repeated unconsciously. These insights are not forced. They emerge because the mind is no longer clouded by fear and urgency. Prayer has cleared the inner field. Outer change often lags behind inner change, and this delay can test trust. The mind wants evidence quickly, yet consciousness unfolds in its own rhythm. When prayer is understood correctly, patience is not passive waiting but confident allowing. You act when clarity appears and rest when it does not, without anxiety in either state. Alignment also changes how you interpret challenges that persist. Instead of seeing them as proof of failure, you begin to view them as indicators of where understanding is still deepening. This perspective removes discouragement. Each challenge becomes an invitation to return to awareness rather than a reason to doubt. As consciousness stabilizes, patterns begin to shift. Relationships adjust, opportunities appear, and obstacles dissolve or lose their significance. These changes often occur quietly, without dramatic intervention. They may appear coincidental, yet they reflect a deeper order coming into expression. Prayer that aligns consciousness also prevents the cycle of dependence on external validation. You no longer need constant confirmation that things are improving. The inner sense of rightness becomes sufficient. This inner sufficiency is what allows outer improvements to unfold without desperation. When outer changes do occur, they are often more sustainable because they are rooted in understanding rather than effort. Solutions that arise from aligned consciousness tend to address root causes rather than surface symptoms. This depth prevents the repetition of the same problems in different forms. Alignment does not guarantee a life without challenges. It guarantees a way of meeting challenges without being overwhelmed. This distinction is crucial. Prayer does not remove you from life. It equips you to engage life from a place of clarity. In this clarity, decisions are made with less conflict, and consequences are accepted with greater peace. As this way of praying becomes familiar, you notice that outer circumstances lose some of their power to define your state of mind. Success does not inflate you, and difficulty does not defeat you. Your sense of stability comes from within rather than from conditions. This inner stability is the true evidence of aligned consciousness. Prayer, then, is not a technique for changing the world, but a means of seeing the world differently. When you see differently, you live differently. The outer world responds accordingly, not because it has been forced to change, but because it reflects a deeper shift that has already taken place within awareness. In this understanding, you stop asking when things will improve and start noticing how you are improving in your way of seeing, responding, and trusting. This improvement in consciousness is the real work of prayer. Outer results are simply the visible expression of that invisible work unfolding in its proper time and order. When prayer matures beyond words and techniques, it ceases to be an occasional practice and becomes a way of living. It no longer belongs to a specific time, place, or posture. It flows quietly through ordinary moments, shaping perception, intention, and action. Life itself becomes the field in which prayer operates, not as a separate spiritual activity, but as a continuous awareness guiding every experience. This shift begins when you recognize that prayer is not confined to moments of stillness, but extends into movement, work, conversation, and rest. Awareness does not switch on and off. It deepens or dulls depending on attention. When attention remains anchored in presence, even simple tasks carry a sense of meaning and order. You are not trying to sanctify daily life. You are discovering that daily life has always been sacred when lived consciously. As prayer becomes a way of being, effort decreases. You no longer feel the need to constantly evaluate your spiritual progress or compare your inner life with imagined standards. The desire to perform spirituality fades, replaced by a natural sincerity. You act from what feels right rather than from what looks right. This authenticity simplifies life, reducing inner conflict and freeing energy for creative expression. Work changes under this awareness. Instead of being a source of strain or identity, it becomes an expression of intelligence in action. You do what is required with care, but without excessive attachment to outcomes. Success is appreciated without inflation, and setbacks are met without self-judgment. Prayer, expressed as awareness, steadies you in both. Relationships also transform. When prayer lives as awareness, listening becomes deeper and more compassionate. You are less inclined to react defensively or impose your will. Instead, you respond from clarity. This does not mean you avoid boundaries or difficult conversations. It means those conversations arise from understanding rather than emotional charge. Connection deepens because presence replaces projection. In this way of living, decisions are guided more by inner alignment than by external pressure. You sense when to act and when to wait, when to speak and when to remain silent. This sensitivity is not mystical, it is practical. It arises from being attuned to the movement of life rather than resisting it. Choices made from this place tend to be simpler and more effective. Prayer as a way of being also reshapes rest. Rest is no longer an escape from life but a continuation of awareness. You allow yourself to pause without guilt, trusting that stillness is productive in its own way. In rest, insight integrates and balance restores itself. This trust in rest counters the belief that constant activity is required to remain valuable or safe. Challenges continue to arise, but they are met differently. Instead of seeing them as interruptions to a spiritual life, you recognize them as part of it. Each challenge reveals where awareness can deepen and where false assumptions can be released. Prayer does not remove difficulty, it transforms difficulty into a context for understanding. As awareness permeates life, gratitude emerges naturally, not as forced positivity, but as recognition of support that has always been present. You notice small harmonies, timely insights, and quiet moments of peace that previously went unnoticed. Gratitude becomes a response to reality rather than a technique to improve it. This way of living dissolves the divide between sacred and ordinary. There is no need to withdraw from the world to be spiritual, nor to abandon spirituality to function in the world. Both coexist because both are expressions of the same underlying reality. Prayer is no longer something added to life. It is the lens through which life is seen. Over time, you realize that prayer has quietly reshaped your identity. You no longer define yourself primarily by roles, achievements, or struggles. Your sense of self rests in awareness rather than in circumstance. This does not make you detached. It makes you resilient. You engage fully without being consumed. As prayer becomes continuous awareness, fear loses its dominance. Not because you have eliminated uncertainty, but because uncertainty no longer threatens your sense of being supported. You trust the unfolding of life even when the path is not clearly visible. This trust is calm, steady, and free of urgency. Living prayer is not dramatic. It does not announce itself through grand experiences or constant emotion. It is known by its effects: simplicity, clarity, compassion, and inner stability. Life feels less fragmented and more coherent. Actions align more naturally with values. You feel guided without being controlled. In this state, prayer fulfills its deepest purpose. It restores the awareness of unity that effort-based spirituality often obscures. You live from a center that is not shaken by change, yet responsive to it. This center does not withdraw from life, it animates life with intelligence, care, and quiet confidence. allowing each day to unfold with a sense of meaning that does not depend on circumstances. What has been revealed through this understanding is not a new method to master, but a return to what has always been quietly waiting beneath effort, fear, and habit. Prayer was never meant to exhaust you, confuse you, or leave you wondering whether you did enough. Its true purpose is to awaken you to the reality that life is already sustained by an intelligence greater than personal struggle, and that this intelligence is not separate from your own being. As your way of praying changes, your way of living inevitably follows. You no longer approach life as a problem to solve, but as an unfolding to trust. Silence replaces strain. Awareness replaces anxiety. Understanding replaces fear. You discover that peace is not something you earn after circumstances improve, but something you touch first, allowing circumstances to reorganize naturally around that inner stability. Prayer, in its truest sense, gently restores you to your center again and again. It teaches you to listen more than ask, to recognize more than request, and to trust more than control. From this place, guidance is not forced, strength is not manufactured, and faith is not blind. It is clear, grounded, and quietly confident. When prayer becomes awareness, life stops feeling like something happening to you and begins to feel like something moving through you. You act without hurry, decide without panic, and rest without guilt. Even in uncertainty, there is a steady sense of being held, directed, and supported. This is not because every answer is visible, but because you have learned where to stand while answers unfold. In this way, prayer completes its work not by changing who you are, but by revealing who you have always been beneath effort and fear. And from that revelation, life flows with greater ease, clarity, and meaning, moment by moment.